There are very few compliments in military history, quite as unusual as the one German High Command paid British commandos in the 5th year of the Second World War. A compliment delivered not through praise, but through fear. Through an official order so severe that it remains one of the most notorious documents of the entire conflict. In October 1942, Adolf Hitler personally signed a directive instructing that any captured British commando, regardless of uniform, regardless of whether they had already surrendered, should be executed on the spot without trial. It is a strange, dark kind of tribute, but a tribute nonetheless, because no army issues an order like that against soldiers it considers unremarkable. Something about these particular men, their methods, their audacity, and the sheer psychological damage they had already inflicted on German confidence had rattled the highest levels of the Nazi war machine badly enough that its response was not simply to fight them, but to attempt to erase the normal rules of war entirely where they were concerned. To understand how a relatively small force of British soldiers earned that kind of reaction, it helps to go back to the summer of 1940, to a Britain that had just been humiliatingly pushed off the European continent at Dunkirk, an army stripped of much of its heavy equipment, a population bracing for invasion, and a prime minister determined that his country would not simply sit and wait to be attacked. Winston Churchill, never a man content with pure defense, demanded the creation of a new kind of soldier, one capable of striking back at occupied Europe immediately, even while the rest of the British Army was still rebuilding itself. He wanted raiding forces that could land on enemy-held coastlines under cover of darkness, hit hard, cause chaos, and disappear again before the Germans could properly organize a response. Out of that demand came the Commandos, an entirely new branch of the British military built from volunteers who were, quite deliberately, pushed through some of the harshest training regimes the Army had ever devised. The training itself became almost as legendary as the raids that followed, and for good reason. At Achnacarry Castle in the Scottish Highlands, recruits were put through punishing marches across brutal terrain, carrying full equipment, forced river crossings in freezing water, live firing exercises where real bullets cracked close enough overhead to be genuinely, deliberately terrifying, and endless drilling in unarmed combat, knife fighting, and silent movement designed to strip away hesitation entirely. Men who failed to keep pace were simply returned to their original units without ceremony, a policy that ensured only the toughest, most determined volunteers ever actually wore the Green Beret. The result was a force that approached combat with a mindset genuinely different from most conventional infantry of the period. Men trained specifically to operate in small groups deep inside hostile territory, to strike quickly and violently, and to trust entirely in speed, surprise, and ruthless efficiency rather than sheer numbers or heavy firepower. The first raids were modest, sometimes almost experimental, probing operations along the French and Norwegian coastlines designed as much to learn lessons as to inflict serious damage. But it did not take long before the Commandos demonstrated exactly what this new kind of warfare could achieve. In late December 1941, a commando force landed on the Norwegian islands around Vagsø in a raid that combined naval bombardment, air support, and ground assault. With a level of coordination that startled German garrison troops who had, until that point, considered their coastal postings relatively safe backwaters, far from any serious fighting. German defenders, many of them second-line troops not expecting anything close to a full-scale assault, found themselves fighting house to house against soldiers who moved with a speed and aggression that conventional training had simply not prepared them for. The raid destroyed fish oil factories vital to German war production, sank several ships, and inflicted casualties disproportionate to the size of the raiding force, but its real impact went well beyond the immediate physical damage. German High Command, reviewing reports of the action, became acutely aware that no stretch of occupied coastline, however remote, could now be considered genuinely safe. That anxiety deepened considerably a few months later, in March 1942, with an operation that has since become one of the most celebrated raids in British military history. Operation Chariot targeted the massive dry dock at Saint-Nazaire on the French Atlantic coast, the only facility on that stretch of ocean large enough to service Germany's most powerful battleship, the Tirpitz. Destroying it would force any damaged German capital ship to sail all the way back to home waters for repairs, running a gauntlet of British naval and air power along the way. The plan itself was audacious almost to the point of recklessness. An obsolete destroyer packed with delayed action explosives rammed directly into the dock gates, accompanied by a small flotilla of motor launches carrying commando demolition teams tasked with destroying the surrounding pumping stations and machinery before withdrawing. German coastal defenses opened fire almost immediately as the small British force approached, and the fighting that followed was ferocious, chaotic, and desperately costly for the raiders. Many of the small wooden launches were shot to pieces before their troops could even land, and the commando teams who did make it ashore fought running battles through the dock complex against vastly superior numbers, working with grim determination to place their charges before German reinforcements could overwhelm them entirely. The physical outcome of the raid was, in narrow military terms, a decisive success. The old destroyer's hidden explosives detonated the following day, right as German officers were inspecting the wreckage, destroying the dock gates so thoroughly that the facility remained unusable for the rest of the war, permanently denying the Tirpitz any safe haven on the Atlantic coast. But the human cost had been severe, and only a small fraction of the raiding force made it back to British shores, with many killed and a significant number captured. And yet, even among those who were taken prisoner, German accounts describe a grudging, almost unsettled respect for the sheer determination these men had shown, continuing to fight and complete their demolition tasks, even as their chances of escape evaporated around them. One German officer present during the aftermath reportedly remarked that he had never seen soldiers fight with such single-minded purpose while so completely surrounded and outnumbered, an observation that captures precisely the kind of psychological unease these raids were designed to produce. It was not simply the physical destruction that unsettled German commanders, though the material damage from raids like Saint-Nazaire was certainly significant. It was the growing realization that an entire coastline stretching from Norway down through France could never again be treated as safely rear-echelon territory. Garrison troops, who had once considered themselves fortunate to be posted away from the fighting fronts, now found themselves living under constant, gnawing uncertainty, never quite sure whether any particular night might bring a sudden, violent raid out of the darkness. This forced Germany into an enormously costly strategic response, diverting huge numbers of troops, engineers, and resources into building the extensive coastal fortifications that would eventually become known as the Atlantic Wall, a defensive construction project that consumed materials and manpower Germany desperately needed elsewhere on other fronts. In a very real sense, a relatively small number of British raiders had managed to tie down and redirect resources far out of proportion to their own numbers, purely through the psychological effect of demonstrating that no stretch of coastline could be considered truly secure. Another operation, smaller in scale, but arguably just as significant in demonstrating the sheer audacity of commando tactics, took place in February 1942, near the French village of Bruneval. British intelligence had identified a German radar installation there, a Würzburg apparatus whose technical secrets were of enormous value to the ongoing electronic and technological struggle unfolding largely unseen behind the more visible fighting of the war. Rather than attempting a purely naval or aerial destruction of the site, planners opted for something considerably bolder, a parachute assault, landing commando troops directly onto French soil under cover of darkness, close enough to the target that they could seize the radar equipment intact, dismantle key components with the help of an accompanying technical specialist, and then fight their way back to a beach extraction point under naval cover. The raid succeeded brilliantly, catching the German garrison almost entirely by surprise, and the captured components provided British scientists with priceless insight into German radar technology, insight that would go on to inform countermeasures used throughout the rest of the war. For German forces stationed along the coast, the raid delivered an unmistakable message that British commandos could strike not only against ports and factories, but against sensitive, supposedly secure technical installations deep enough inland that soldiers there had never imagined themselves as frontline troops at all. By the time Hitler's infamous Commando Order arrived in late 1942, this pattern of repeated, unpredictable, psychologically corrosive raiding had already done enormous damage to German confidence along the entire western coastline of occupied Europe. The order itself, demanding summary execution rather than standard treatment as prisoners of war, represented an extraordinary and legally indefensible departure from established military conduct, and it reveals, more clearly than any battlefield statistic could, just how deeply unsettled German high command had become. An army that felt secure in its ability to defeat an enemy through conventional means does not typically resort to abandoning the established rules of warfare. It does so when it feels that conventional methods are simply not working, when the usual assumptions about safe rear areas, secure garrisons, and predictable front lines have been repeatedly and humiliatingly proven false by an enemy who refuses to fight according to expected patterns. German soldiers stationed in coastal garrisons across occupied Europe increasingly wrote home, according to surviving letters and post-war interviews, describing a persistent unease that had very little to do with any specific ongoing battle, and everything to do with the simple knowledge that commando raids could, in principle, happen anywhere, at any time, with almost no warning. Sentries doubled their vigilance not because intelligence suggested a specific imminent attack, but because the mere possibility, proven real again and again through actual raids, had become impossible to ignore. This is precisely the kind of psychological effect that small, highly trained special forces are uniquely capable of producing, an impact that spreads far beyond the immediate physical damage of any single operation, seeping instead into the daily experience of thousands of soldiers who might never personally encounter a commando raid, but who nonetheless found themselves living under its constant, invisible shadow. There is a particular quality to the way these raids were executed that deserves closer attention, because it explains a great deal about why they produced such an outsized psychological effect. Commando operations were rarely, if ever, straightforward frontal assaults. Instead, planners went to enormous lengths studying tides, moon phases, coastal currents, and enemy patrol patterns for weeks before a single boat ever left British shores, all in service of achieving one specific outcome: the element of total surprise. A raid arriving at precisely the moment German sentries were least alert, striking with overwhelming local force at a single narrow point before melting away again within the hour, created an impression among defenders that bore little resemblance to the actual scale of the attacking force. German garrison commanders reviewing after-action reports frequently overestimated the size of the raiding parties that had struck them, partly because the speed, violence, and coordination of the assault simply did not match their expectations of what a small infiltration force should be capable of achieving. This misjudgment of scale became, in its own way, another weapon entirely, feeding directly into the growing sense among German high command that these raids represented something qualitatively different from conventional military threats. Individual accounts from German soldiers who survived these encounters preserved in post-war interviews and captured wartime correspondence, repeatedly emphasize just how disorientating it was to face opponents trained to such a specific, uncompromising standard. A junior officer stationed near the French coast in 1942 described the aftermath of a smaller, less famous raid on his own sector, recalling that his men had been trained to expect conventional infantry tactics, cautious advances under covering fire, predictable patterns of attack that gave defenders time to organize a coherent response. What they encountered instead was something closer to a sudden storm, soldiers moving with a silent, controlled aggression through positions the garrison had considered secure, engaging in brutal close quarters, fighting before. Most defenders had even fully grasped that an attack was underway at all. He wrote that his men had begun referring to the British raiders using a term that translated roughly as ghost soldiers, not out of any belief in the supernatural, but because of how completely these men seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with terrifying precision, and then simply vanish back into the darkness from which they had come. This reputation for ruthless close-quarters skill was not accidental, but the direct product of training methods that broke sharply from conventional military doctrine of the period. Commando recruits spent considerable time learning techniques of silent killing, developed in part by instructors who had studied unarmed combat extensively before the war, techniques designed specifically for the brutal, split-second reality of hand-to-hand fighting in the dark, in confined spaces, where a single moment of hesitation could mean the difference between completing a mission and dying in the attempt. The distinctive fighting knife carried by many commandos became, almost by accident, a symbol that took on outsized significance in German accounts of these encounters, less because of its practical battlefield role, which was real but limited, and more because of what it represented: an enemy trained and willing to fight at the closest, most personal range imaginable, without hesitation. Rumors and exaggerated stories about commando fighting prowess spread quickly through German garrison units, often growing more dramatic with each retelling, until the psychological effect had arguably outpaced the actual physical threat these raids posed in strictly statistical terms. It is worth pausing to consider just how unusual this dynamic was within the broader context of the war. Most military engagements of the period involved large formations, tanks, artillery, aircraft, thousands of soldiers maneuvering against one another across wide fronts. The commandos operated at the opposite extreme, small teams, sometimes numbering only a few dozen men, striking precise targets and then disappearing entirely, leaving German commanders with a peculiarly modern problem that conventional military thinking of the era struggled to solve. How does an army defend an entire coastline against an enemy who might strike anywhere with almost no advance warning, using a tiny fraction of the manpower that would normally be required for a conventional assault? The honest answer, as German high command gradually and uncomfortably discovered, was that it could not be done cheaply or efficiently. Every mile of coastline theoretically had to be defended as though it might be the next target, a requirement that consumed staggering quantities of concrete, steel, artillery pieces, and manpower that could otherwise have been deployed to more conventional and arguably more urgent fronts, particularly as the war against the Soviet Union intensified through 1942 and 1943. This strategic dimension of the commando threat, often overlooked in favor of more dramatic accounts of individual raids, may in fact represent their single most significant contribution to the eventual outcome of the war. Every gun emplacement built along the French coast, specifically in response to the fear of raids like Saint-Nazaire and Vagsau, was a gun that could not be sent east. Every division of second-line troops tied down on garrison duty, nervously patrolling beaches and cliff tops against a threat that might never actually materialize in their particular sector, was a division unavailable for offensive operations elsewhere. Historians examining German military planning documents from this period have found repeated references to coastal vulnerability as a factor shaping broader strategic decisions, a testament to just how seriously these raids, disproportionate in scale to their actual numbers, were being taken at the very highest levels of German command. The reputation the Commandos built during these early years continued to cast a long shadow right through to the final years of the war, influencing not only how Germany defended its coastlines, but how individual soldiers approached the mere possibility of encountering these units in the field. Even later in the war, as larger and more conventional Allied operations came to dominate the fighting following the Normandy landings, German accounts continued to single out encounters with commando units for a particular kind of dread, distinct from the fear inspired by regular infantry or armored formations. There was something about facing troops trained to that specific, uncompromising standard of aggression and precision that lodged itself differently in the collective memory of the men who survived those encounters, a fear less about the scale of the threat and more about its unpredictability, its refusal to conform to the patterns and expectations that ordinary soldiers relied upon to make sense of the chaos around them. By the time the war finally ended, the Commandos had firmly established themselves as one of the defining innovations of British military thinking during the conflict, a template that would go on to influence Special Forces doctrine across the world for decades afterward. But perhaps their most striking legacy remains that single, chilling piece of paper signed by Hitler himself in October 1942, an order that, in its very existence, admitted something no ordinary battlefield report ever could. It admitted that a relatively small number of exceptionally trained British soldiers had gotten inside the head of an entire military apparatus, forcing it to abandon its own rules of war simply because it could no longer trust its ordinary methods to keep them out.